The title of this lecture is The Wealth of Nations, and I'm going to talk about Adam Smith and several other philosophers and philosophical viewpoints. Adam Smith is regarded as the very first economist. He probably wouldn't have called himself an economist, he would have called himself a moral philosopher. His big work that he wrote before The Wealth of Nations was a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiment. Now the full title of his book, I've got to look it up, right? I mean, because no one ever calls it by its full name. The complete title of his book is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. So this book is an investigation that seeks to discover what it is that makes one nation wealthy and one nation not. How do two nations that may seem very similar end up one poor, one rich? What causes economic growth? Economic growth has been a central piece of economics since the beginning of economics. That in essence is what Adam Smith's book is about. And I'm going to share with you 4 perspectives on what it is that causes a nation to grow, meaning what causes a nation's wealth to increase. What are the causes of the wealth of nations? Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the Physiocrats. I've talked about them before. Thomas Jefferson was a Physiocrat. Now, the Physiocrats were, of course, landowners who were studying economics, and the argument they made was that all wealth comes from the land. And you'll remember that they made this argument in order to argue only landowners should be taxed, and therefore only landowners should have a say in government. And since they were landowners, it was a little bit of a self-serving philosophy. And there are a couple of big holes in this philosophy. The first being is that there are examples of countries with a lot of land that contain a lot of natural resources, and these countries are poor. And you can find examples of small countries with very few resources that are extremely wealthy. Japan comes to mind. Japan's on a little bitty island. I mean, okay, to put it in context, if you were to add up all the acres of corn grown in the United States, we have more land in corn in the US than Japan has land, and by a pretty wide margin. So why is Japan wealthy when they have so little land? What is it about them that makes them wealthy? So that physiocrat worldview that land is what you need in order to have wealth has some problems. Now, there are parts of their philosophy that I think are right on spot. For example, they would argue that productive soil is going to be worth more than unproductive soil. Land with minerals is more productive than land without. Land with timber is more productive than land without, and so therefore more valuable. And so you see this ability for a marginal productivity of land, for different pieces of land to have different worth out in a marketplace, because what you can get from the land is more or less valuable. Therefore, the land is more or less valuable. And I kind of like that aspect of that physiocrat worldview. Now, the next view I want to talk about is the view of Karl Marx, Marxism. Marx believed in a thing called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value was actually an idea that Adam Smith came up with. Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, almost as like a little throwaway section, was trying to kind of write his way through trying to figure out how markets worked and how markets assigned value. And he said, if a guy can go out hunting and catch 2 beavers, or during the same time period could have caught 1 deer, then it must be that 2 beaver are worth the same as 1 deer. And what he was really talking about was opportunity cost. You're going to pick the one that's worth more when you go out hunting. You'll hunt that one. So it really wasn't, in my opinion as an economist, it wasn't about the value of a day of labor. It was about the value of what you might produce and about opportunity cost. But Marx kind of took that concept and ran with it. So the Marxist view is that a person and their labor is the source of value. And there's some interesting things that pop up that are problematic. Well, the first is that if you are what Marx would have called a capitalist, is you own capital, you own land, and you have someone else working on your land, then that person is someone you're exploiting, because any profit you make is profit you made off their labor, and it should have belonged to them instead of you. A Marxist worldview discounts the value of an entrepreneur. They would argue that an entrepreneur that brings capital to the table has just stolen that capital from some laborer and is then using it in order to steal it from even more laborers. So it's very kind of problematic in that sense, in that it really it's a revolutionary idea in that it puts the people who own assets against the ones who don't, and puts them in kind of a combative state, whereas a more capitalistic worldview says that we're all kind of working together. Well, there's a couple of things that kind of pop up that are problematic in that worldview, that Marxist viewpoint. And the first is, what do you do when person A produces something very valuable and person B does not? Is a brain surgeon actually worth the same amount of money as a janitor? And we're not talking about their worth as a human being here. We're talking about what is their dollar value out in the marketplace. Well, the Marxist worldview would be that they have to have the same value out in the marketplace, and that the person who's getting more value for their labor must have exploited somebody in order to get that. So in that viewpoint, there's no real way to kind of rank the value of someone's labor. Everyone's labor is worth the same. It really doesn't matter what you're producing. Now, the problem with that is, how do you signal people to produce the things that society actually values? How do you signal people to go through the effort to be a brain surgeon? Well, there's no real mechanism inside of Marxism in order to do that. And so you end up with a government using policy to control how people use their resources. Now, the other issue is what happens when we have very productive people and people who are not very productive, people with high marginal productivity versus those with low marginal productivity. Some people can just work harder than others. Some people can just get more done in the same amount of time than others. The Marx worldview addresses that with the statement that Marx is famous for: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Meaning, yeah, we'll recognize there are high ability, higher productivity individuals, and they're going to go out and be higher productivity and put out a bunch of work and put out a bunch of effort, and as a result, we'll have goods and services and whatever you want to call it, wealth, for the lack of a better word. And that person, we're going to take the wealth they generated and we're going to take part of it and assign it to someone who maybe is less productive. And so everyone is equal in a society like this, which in its own way is problematic because it disincentivizes the individual that's very productive. So that's a problematic way of addressing where does the wealth of a nation come from and how is wealth generated. Let's circle back towards Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, again, the first economist, wrote that book about the wealth of nations, and his conclusion was that wealth comes from two things. The first thing is specialization. And the example that he used was a pen factory, like, a pen, like you would, not an ink pen, but like a needle and a thread, like a pen. And he observed that a group of individuals could get together and divide up their tasks inside the pen factory and get very good at their task and do their one task all day long. And as a group, they could produce more pens in a day than they could if they were all separate, producing pens from start to finish by breaking things into an assembly line. There goes the dog. And then he put forth the position, after you've specialized and made the thing that you're good at, that you're productive at, you then trade with someone else in order to get the things that you are less productive at making. And by extension, if you'll specialize and then trade with other people, wealth inside the nation will go up. If a nation itself will specialize and focus on what they're good at producing and then trade with other nations, wealth inside the nation will go up. And what I really like about this is it really sidesteps the issues with the other two worldviews. And this notion of specialization and trade, and that's where wealth comes from, is really good at filling in the gaps in the other two ideas. Computer software is very valuable, but it's really tenuous to say that it came from the land. Yes, you can make that physiocrat argument the computer itself had to come from the earth. The software came from someone's brain. Someone's brain created that. Maybe you would call that labor created that. Maybe that's the fair way to look at it. But because software is such a unique product, it's something that I can trade, and after I've made it one time, I can sell it an infinite number of times. And so the amount of value I can create by creating computer software is almost infinite, because I can just keep sharing the computer software with someone and they can thank me for that software by giving me some money. And that specialization and trade worldview can account for the fact that, can account for these differences in productivity, whether it be in people or in land, that the previous two views couldn't account for. It encourages you to focus on what you're most productive at, and to do that and trade for what you're not productive at. It creates markets. It's a system where you have markets that assign value. And so there's no question of, well, what should we be doing? Well, we should be doing the most valuable thing we can find. And we do that, and then we find someone else who specialized in something else, and they did the thing most valuable for them. And then we trade, and we come together, and we have something more than what we would have if we didn't collaborate and work together in that way. So those are three kind of philosophical, historic worldviews on where wealth comes from. Now I'm going to do something really controversial. I'm going to throw out a fourth. Well, first of all, I want to say this. I don't like lists. I don't want you to memorize a list. I want you to understand what's going on. So a good challenge for you would be to say, well, what's a fifth? If I've got mine and there's these three others I've identified, what are the ones I've left out? What are other sources of wealth, right? What are ways we could break wealth down that don't fit into these categories? So my hypothesis, my fourth thing on the list, this is going to be controversial. I have some friends who would strongly disagree with this. I believe that wealth comes from policy. Policy is what creates wealth. We're going to walk through policy this semester, and at the end of the semester, you tell me whether you think I'm right or not. And if you think I'm wrong and you posit a good argument for that, you can still get an A in the class. I just want to be clear on that, right? In fact, if you think I'm wrong and you're able to prove me wrong, right? You're able to put together a strong argument that I'm wrong, I'm thrilled. I love it when students prove me wrong. When I tell a student, that'll never work and here's why, and they go, oh yeah, let me show you, I'm gonna make it work. I love it, right? That's what I do as a professor, right? It's odd, but being wrong is just part of it. Prove me wrong. I love it when students prove me wrong. It means you're thinking, so that's your challenge. Prove me wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Here's what I mean by that. A nation can choose policies that will cause the economy to grow, cause wealth to grow, cause people to become wealthier, cause incomes to go up, cause people to have more stuff to eat, and so forth and so on, by creating policies that are economic growth oriented. So yes, policies can create wealth. Good policy unlocks the wealth creating potential of people. Bad policy locks it away so people won't go out and create wealth. And so my claim is that the true source of wealth is actually policy. What leads to a wealthy nation are the decisions that the rulers of that nation, the leaders of that nation make. The rules that they lay out for running the economy and how we're going to interact with each other. A good example of that is the notion of property rights. Where there are strong property rights, where I can own things, and where there's legal systems to protect my ownership rights. Something as simple as a car title. Where there are strong property rights, there is always wealth. I'm going to leave you with that. I'm putting all of these videos in a playlist. I'm going to put that playlist right over here. If you want to go watch them, make sure you catch them all. You're going to want to know this stuff if you're in the class. And some of you might not be in my class, and I'd invite you to hit the subscribe button right here. I hope you like what I'm doing here, and I don't mind putting all this stuff on YouTube for the whole world to see because I kind of think people need to know this stuff. Knowing about policy is a good idea. Thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you next time.